Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. Bonjour and Quay. My name is Gabriella Solera. I'm the acting manager for local immigration partnership for Lanark and Renfrew counties. I'm so pleased to be here today to open this event, Statelessness, a global, a Canadian, and a human perspective, as part of our event series for the fall edition of Culture Connect. We are so happy to have you all join us for this really important conversation. Just for a bit of background on our organisation, so the Local Immigration Partnership aims to strengthen the role of local communities across Lanark and Renfrew counties in integrating and serving our newcomer population. Local immigration partnerships are funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, or the IRCC, which is a department of the Government of Canada. And we support communities in bringing together service providers, settlement agencies, community groups, employers, and other key municipal organisations to create a welcoming and inclusive community for newcomers. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we welcome our speakers today. So along the bottom of your screen, you will find a chat button. Please feel free to use this feature if you have comments you would like to share with your fellow attendees today. If you have any questions for the panelists, you can type them into the chat or raise your virtual or physical hand once we arrive at the Q&A or question and answer portion of today's event at around 11:10 a.m. We'll allow good time to answer as many questions as we can while staying within our time together today. So today's session is, of course, also being recorded so that we can continue to share the knowledge and expertise that is discussed. Today's focus is the critical issue of statelessness. This profound issue affects millions of people worldwide, denying them access to basic rights and protections. So, statelessness refers to a condition in which an individual is not considered a citizen or national by any country. This means that they do not possess legal rights and protections that come with citizenship, such as the right to vote, access to healthcare, education, and employment opportunities. So statelessness can occur for various reasons, including but not limited to discrimination, conflict and displacement, changes in nationality laws, and even birth. So statelessness not only strips individuals of their identity, but also hinders their ability to participate fully in society. By raising awareness and fostering dialogue, we can work towards a future where everyone has the right to belong. So we are honoured to have a distinguished panel of experts with us here today. Please welcome Deny Dobobrov, the Director of International Relations for the World Roma Federation and an accredited UN representative. Deny will address statelessness through the Roma experience, advocating for their recognition as a stateless nation and working with governments, particularly in Eastern Europe, to promote Roma rights and self-determination. Our next panellist is Andrew Griffith, an expert on multiculturalism and citizenship in Canada. With over 30 years of public service, including as a Director General for Citizenship and Multiculturalism, Andrew has written extensively on Canadian multicultural policies. He's a fellow Canadian Global Affairs. He's a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Environics Institute. Today, Andrew will share with us insights from his research on statelessness and its impact on immigrant communities in Canada. So finally, please welcome Jamie Chai Yun Liew, Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa, author of novel Dandelion and non-fiction book Ghost Citizens, and expert in immigration, refugee and citizenship law. Some of Jamie's works focus on statelessness and its impacts, and she will discuss the legal challenges faced by stateless individuals in Canada, particularly regarding access to services and the broader social consequences. So welcome once again to our esteemed panelists, and I will now pass along to Deny. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Deny Dobobrov, and I'm the Director of International Relations at the World Roma Federation. Together, today, we're going to address an urgent issue impacting millions of Roma people globally, which is statelessness. The Roma, often called Romani, are a diverse ethnic group that originally migrated from northern India about 1,000 years ago, spreading through Persia into Europe and eventually across continents. Today, Roma communities are vibrant parts of many societies, but they continue to face marginalization and exclusion. The World Roma Federation, led by Mr. Janos Stoica, is dedicated to advocating for the rights, recognition, and inclusion of Roma people globally. Our work combines a top-down approach, engaging in diplomacy and connecting with high-level government and institutional partners, with grassroots partnerships on the front lines. While we address Roma needs directly, Mr. Stoica and I are also committed to working with governments and international institutions at the highest levels, promoting systemic change that makes nationality accessible and rights protected. Historically, the Roma people migrated westwards from India, moving through Persia and arriving in southeastern Europe by the 14th century. Along the way, they encountered significant challenges, including deep-rooted prejudice, exclusion, and even enslavement in parts of Eastern Europe, especially in present-day Romania. Roma people were subjected to slavery for nearly 500 years, a brutal period lasting until the mid-19th century. Enslaved Roma were denied basic freedoms and forced to work under harsh conditions, with this legacy impacting Roma communities for generations. Despite these hardships, the Roma contributed significantly to societies where they lived. However, persistent prejudice and exclusion continued to hinder integration. And during the Holocaust, Roma communities experienced severe persecution, with hundreds of thousands, perhaps up to 1 million, murdered by the Nazis. This history of exclusion and discrimination laid the groundwork for today's statelessness crisis, leaving many Roma disconnected from the rights and belonging that come with national recognition. Next slide, please. Today, the Roma are often referred to as a stateless nation. Statelessness, which means lacking a legal nationality, is a harsh reality for tens of thousands of Roma in Europe and beyond. Stateless individuals lack birth certificates, identity cards, passports, and other documents that are essential for establishing legal identity and national belonging. This absence of documentation means they cannot access basic services, leaving them in a state of legal limbo. Statelessness isn't just a bureaucratic issue for Roma, it's an existential challenge that keeps them from claiming fundamental rights and protections. They are part of their communities but are disconnected from any formal legal status, a reality that perpetuates generational exclusion and limits their futures. Next slide, please. The impact of statelessness on Roma people is severe and far-reaching. Without nationality, they face immense barriers in accessing education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, services that are fundamental to security and well-being. Stateless Roma families cannot vote, secure stable housing, or even register their children's births. This cycle of exclusion means that Roma children are often born into statelessness, inheriting a condition that hinders every aspect of their future. The risks are also physical. Stateless Roma are often vulnerable to harassment and detention by authorities as they lack any recognized legal identity. For example, in Italy, where many Roma are descendants of refugees from the former Yugoslavia, even simple steps to obtain documents can mean navigating confusing, highly restrictive systems. This lack of status affects every facet of their daily lives and creates constant insecurity. Next slide, please. In closing, the statelessness of Roma people is not merely a legal technicality, but a denial of dignity and fundamental human rights. Statelessness isn't something anyone should inherit. It isolates individuals from the protections and opportunities most of us take for granted. At the World Roma Federation, we are dedicated to raising awareness of this issue and advocating for actionable solutions. We actively push for reforms that simplify the path to nationality for Roma communities, collaborating with governments to make legal recognition more accessible. Our work involves a dual approach, engaging with diplomatic leaders and institutions to drive systemic change from the top down, while also partnering with grassroots levels who are on the front lines of the fight for Roma rights. We believe that change requires collective action, and we are eager to connect with individuals, advocates, and organizations who share our vision. Together, we can help ensure that Roma are not invisible, but recognized and respected as full members of society. I want to thank everybody, all of the viewers. I want to thank Gabriella and the rest of the panel for having me. And I will be here for any questions that may arise later. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Danny. And yeah, once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat or during the Q&A portion of today's session, have them ready to go to ask Danny. I'll now pass over to Andrew.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just get my slide up. Just wait, where is it? There we are. And I'll just play it. Okay, well, in contrast to Denny's presentation, I suspect to Jamie's presentation, I'm going to focus on what we know from the data. And the data is like all data, it's never perfect, but we've got a reasonable mix of what I would call sort of global data, which is the UNHCR has the macro level, and that's of course understated. We have self-reported data through the Canadian Census. And then we have what I call actual data, which is really sort of taken from departmental operational data in terms of citizenship, immigration, and other programs. And that's about as objective as we can get because it actually measures real people on an individual level. So starting with the census, this is self-reported data again. So here we know that under about 4,000 people in Canada reported not being stateless or having no citizenship. India, surprising to me anyway, was the country that had the most frequently reported place of stateless population. And the Middle East is sort of less surprising given the number of expatriates and displaced people in the Middle East. So that was not very surprising. About half are recent immigrants, in the last 5 years, which probably just reflects the overall increase in immigration over that period of time. And not surprising, about 74% are refugees. But then if we break it down a bit more, here's looking at the census period 2001 to 2010, sort of a 10-year period, and then the 2011 to 2015 period, and then the most recent period. You can see just how much the number of stateless people or former stateless people has increased, and really quite dramatically. So again, I suspect that the 2016-21 period just reflects the overall increase in immigrants and asylum seekers and the like. And then if you look at it from a percentage perspective, what I find interesting in the first period, over a third were actually under the economic category of immigrants, whereas that sort of shifted so dramatically. And now sort of again, 3/4 are refugees, which is what you would expect. And you'd expect a fair portion of families as well. But the economic class is really just down to under 9%. So that's a major shift over the past 20 years or so. So now we're turning to the operational data, which is sort of measuring real people, so to speak. And I think what you can see here, let me just get rid of okay, I'll be okay. What you can see here is that the macro numbers haven't really changed that much in the 2015 to 23 period. But of course, the share has gone down considerably, given that the overall number of permanent residents has increased. So there's two levels of looking at it. Relatively stable in terms of the number of stateless, but percentage of the total population of permanent residents, it's gone down. And then if we look at sort of the temporary resident programs, these are temporary foreign workers, the international mobility program. Here it's negligible. It's virtually, about as close to zero as you can get. But again, you would expect that given sort of the nature of the programs, and it's harder to get in them in one sense. Students have increased significantly over the period, but again, it's still from a very small base. And their percentage is largely consistent in terms of the total number of students. So there are students coming in that are stateless, so we know that, but it's a relatively small number. Asylum claimants actually increased less than I expected. But again, what's interesting here is if you look at in 2015, it was a really large percentage, relatively large percentage of asylum claimants who were stateless. But again, given the overall growth in asylum claimants, the percentage has dropped dramatically. So in one sense, it's almost a numbers game, because if the overall numbers go up, but the numbers of stateless goes up less slowly, then the overall percentage decreases. CBSA removals, so for people who are deemed ineligible to stay in Canada, the numbers are incredibly small in terms of the stateless. And I think that is actually encouraging. It means that the system is working. If you're stateless, you shouldn't be deported in general. And of course, the percentage again has decreased as the number of deportations or removals has increased. And here's just a breakdown. I didn't have the annual numbers, but again, you're sort of seeing that it's not surprising from an immigration policy point of view that you would see the blended and the government-assisted refugees, which tend to be the more vulnerable refugees, having a higher percentage of statelessness than the privately supported refugees. And lastly, citizenship. Here it's actually increased fairly dramatically. I didn't have the 23 numbers, but they're probably comparable, I would expect. And the interesting thing here is that the numbers have the percentage of total new citizens has remained relatively consistent as the number of stateless who are obtaining citizenship has largely matched the increase of the total number of new citizens. The gray area, of course, is the number of undocumented people in Canada. And of course, the numbers there are not very precise. How many of those would be stateless? My general take is that given that most of the so-called feeder groups for undocumented would be temporary foreign workers who haven't left, unsuccessful refugee claimants who haven't left, visitor visa overstays, and international student overstays, or those unable to transition to permanent residency, would largely reflect those groups, and it's unlikely that there'd be a much higher percentage of the undocumented, given that they would be sort of an amalgam of those. Better data might be able to would help there. And UNHCR reports, always good to go to the international reports. That gives the overall one. They use the same data sources that I used. Largely, I went a bit deeper. Their main recommendations were calls for better data. We always want better data. There's a lot of criticism on terms on the HNC mechanism, and that even from my time in at RCC over 10 years ago, it was always a bit of a black box, and there were always complaints about that because it takes more time, and I think the department needs to work more in improving that. There was a need to simplify citizenship procedures. I don't think, but Jamie might have some views on that, that in the Canadian context, it's much more difficult for stateless people than other immigrants. And I haven't seen evidence in the data of that. And of course, you know, some of the same comments that Denny was making in terms of full access and the like. Other studies tend to question self-reporting, like in the census, but that's what we have. And there's not a better way right now, but I use the operational data to try and complement that with some more hard data. The main issue in the Canadian context currently is the first generation cutoff for citizenship. There's a bill before Parliament to eliminate the first generation cutoff and provide a mechanism for the second generation born abroad to obtain Canadian citizenship. Of course, we're waiting for Parliament to actually get back to work for that bill to actually progress. And I did some rough estimates in terms of the number of people who could be affected by that restoration of Canadian citizenship, using a variety of sort of, you know, expatriate data as well as passport data. And these are some of the approximate numbers. So in terms of conclusion, while it's not automatically available, if you request the data on the number of stateless by program, or the departments always respond. So the data is available. I always like to use census data because it provides a big macro view, but the operational provides the more granular view. The overall numbers are small, but of course, small number doesn't mean it doesn't have a big impact on the people who are affected. So, you know, you can't just use a technocratic number, say it's small, it's not important. As Denny mentioned, it is very important for the people who are affected. The other thing that struck me is it's just how much the numbers are increasing between the census periods. But again, I think this reflects the overall growth in Canadian population, number of immigrants. As mentioned before, that refugees, as one would expect, are about 3/4. And we'll be watching to see what happens when Parliament gets back working in terms of how fast C-71 and the nature of the debates and the nature of the final proposal. I'm not seeing any major remaining data gaps, but others may have different views, and hopefully some of that will come out in the following discussions. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions, discussion. And again, thanks for having me on the panel. Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing those statistics and some of that data with us, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to come surrounding that. I'll pass over now to our final panelist, Jamie.
Thank you, Gabriella. I'm just going to share my screen as well to share my presentation. I just want to thank Gabriella and her team for the invitation. It's such an important topic to be discussing. And I also want to thank my co-panelists for setting up the context really nicely for my presentation today. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And I think it's really important because statelessness is an issue that is sometimes driven by Indigenous desire for sovereignty and for statehood. And so just to acknowledge that there are Indigenous communities around the world who are still struggling with obtaining statehood and recognition in their own ways. So I wanted to start by saying that I came to statelessness as a very personal issue. As Gabriella kindly introduced me, I am a law professor. I do practice immigration law, so I have come to the issue of statelessness by representing stateless people. I have actually represented organizations before the Supreme Court of Canada in cases involving stateless persons. But most importantly, the issue of statelessness comes to me because my father was stateless for the first important years of his life. He migrated to Canada as an economic migrant. And at the time, there was no pathway for stateless persons to regularize their status. When I was growing up, I thought this was a very anomalous, strange thing. And I just thought my dad was a very, outlier in terms of the kinds of things that people have in their migration stories and the reasons why they migrate. As I started practicing and studying the issue of statelessness more as a law professor, I realized that this problem is actually quite common, quite nefarious, and quite pervasive all over the world. And as Andrew mentioned, if you look at the UNHCR numbers with regards to statelessness, they claim that there's at least 10 million people who are stateless around the world. But my suspicion that it is far, far bigger number because of the ways in which data are collected. And as Andrew mentioned, that data collection is not always a perfect way to capture a situation. Having said that, I did want to acknowledge, I did publish a book recently on statelessness, and part of the challenge was that people kept asking me, how many stateless people are there? And there's this kind of I guess, desire to quantify the problem. And I guess I want to ask you to maybe move away from that model to quantify and to satiate that appetite of understanding how deep this problem is, because I think one stateless person is enough of a reason to delve into the issue of how it occurs and what this situation really means for people on the ground. And I just want to echo Denny's points in his presentation about how the actual status of statelessness, not having documentation, not having state recognition, is a significant existence, right? It really does affect one's life chances. It can affect people's, as something as benign as ability to join a sports team or travel around the world, to extreme situations where people can't access healthcare, education, housing, to even more stark situations where it's a justification for genocide in many places of the world. So I just want to say that, one of the things that I think is challenging about looking at data is that measurement systems constitute a form of power, and they themselves incorporate theories about social change. And one of the things I want to kind of ignite in my discussion with you today is how in my research it's unearthed who actually belongs and who are deserving of citizens. And so the ways in which people are counted, the ways in which people are being told whether they are citizens or not, whether they can claim to be stateless people or not, is an important thing to consider. Anecdotally, I can tell you that representing clients who were stateless in the legal sense of the term, sometimes were not deemed stateless in legal documentation in various IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada documentation. And in fact, my own father, when he migrated to Canada, in some of his documentation, he was counted as having nationality of the country he traveled from, despite the fact that there was no evidence whatsoever that he was. So I just want to say that I think the numbers are quite low and that they don't capture everything that is in that captures that full population, and also to say that the numbers also tell a story that sometimes we should critique. So in order to provide this kind of context to understand statelessness and how it manifests in law, my bread and butter is that I'm a lawyer. I do socio-legal research. I did embark on a research trip to Malaysia, where my family is from, to try to understand how statelessness is created there, but I also conducted some research here in Canada. My research really involved ethnographic interviews with lawyers, paralegals, members of parliament, advocates, NGO representatives, but most importantly, half of the interviews I conducted were with stateless persons or the parents of stateless children. I also, looked at all the reported case law in Canada and in Malaysia with regards to that affected stateless persons. And I also attended various rallies, registration offices, and the like. And the findings are quite interesting, and I'll share some of them with you now. I kind of use this term ghost citizen to kind of capture three major findings in my research. And the first is, as echoing what Denny said about the Roma community, is that, the lived experience of a stateless person is quite harsh. There are many difficult consequences to not having documentation, but also not having citizenship. And in many of the interviews I had with stateless persons and their families, they described being stateless like an administrative death, like they were in purgatory, that they were watching their friends and community members live on without them because they couldn't engage in the same way that others could, that they were watching their dreams disappear in front of them. And so the term ghost citizen helps me to kind of understand that the lived experience of stateless persons is one like a ghost-like experience, that you're not recognized as a full person, you're not living your full life, you're treated as something that is not really there and invisible to many people. The second way my research kind of uses this term of ghost citizens is that in both Canada and Malaysia, and before I delve into this piece, I do want to give contextual analysis that Canada and Malaysia are both democratic countries that share a history of British colonization, inherited colonial ideas of citizenship, race hierarchy. And in their laws, it's embedded that there are different ways and ideas of belonging. And certainly we have a history in Canada of exclusion through migration and immigration law, and this is no different in Malaysia. And so studying these two contexts together is really eye-opening because they share a lot of the same features. And one of those features is that in many of the legal decisions or the administrative decisions of bureaucrats, a lot of decision makers would tell stateless people, you're actually not our problem. You're the problem of another state. You're a foreigner. You're not, you don't deserve citizenship here. So I kind of term this as, or equate it and relate it to people who might be on the dating scene and they get ghosted by their dates. Well, the same kind of thing is, stateless people are applying for citizenship. They've asked for proper recognition or asked for correction in their documents, and the state is telling them, listen, we're just going to ignore you. We don't recognize you. We don't want to have anything to do with you. We don't consider you part of our community. In Malaysia, this is particularly a stark problem because there is no right to birthright citizenship, meaning that if you're born in the territory of Malaysia, you don't automatically get citizenship like we do here in Canada. And so in Canada, we don't see as many cases like this in the context of citizenship applications. We see it more in Malaysia, but I'll talk about the Canadian cases later on where this does occur in other venues other than citizenship. And finally, the third kind of major finding I found in my research was that not only are states ignoring or denying citizenship to stateless people by saying that you're a foreigner, you're not our problem, you're a problem of another state, they're actually conferring ghost citizenship. And what I mean by that is that despite the fact that there is no evidence or very little evidence or just a very minor tangential link to another country, Canadian officials or Malaysian officials will often tell stateless people, you actually are a citizen of Thailand, of China, of India, any other country that they might have family members at, they might have some sort of link. And say you're a citizen of that country, despite the fact that there's no conferral of citizenship whatsoever. So I call this the act of conferring ghost citizenship because it means it allows a decision maker to say, you're not our problem, but also to say, this is the end of the line. This is a preliminary assessment we've done, and we're not even going to look at the merits of whether or not you actually meet the requirements for citizenship in law. So this narrative that I've kind of pulled through legal decisions, interviews with various people and advocates, and also watching bureaucrats at registrar offices and reading notes of officers, have given this context of a very large narrative that's not, as I said, in the numbers that we're seeing, that some people are treated as not stateless. They're being gaslit. They're being told you're not stateless, you're citizens of other countries. And then on top of that, using that as a reason to deny. This is disturbing for me as a legal scholar because you expect legal venues to use standards of proof or rules of evidence before making a factual finding of whether someone is a citizen of another country. You can't just flippantly make these claims and findings, but yet this is what's happening in both Canada and Malaysia. So I wanted to kind of return, because I was invited to talk about the Canadian context, to talk about 3 specific Canadian case examples. And Denny, I apologize, I could have included the Roma in this as well, and there's a lot of case law around the Roma in refugee cases. So what I'm going to do today is kind of take you through 3 examples very, very quickly about how stateless persons are being denied access to any kind of status in Canada through the Refugee Protection Division at the Immigration and Refugee Board. And the Roma is certainly, the case law around the Roma community is quite large in this respect. So it is something that I invite people to look into if you are interested in that. I just want to set the scene that the Canadian case examples that I'm giving you are refugee cases. So as Andrew mentioned, many of the expected cases of statelessness do appear in refugee law in Canada. And just to preface that, the status of statelessness in and of itself does not allow you to claim refugee protection. So the very fact that you're stateless is not enough for you to claim refugee protection. You also need to show that you are facing a risk of persecution on an enumerated ground, whether it be race, political opinion, religion, nationality, or a membership of a particular social group, and that the state that you are claiming protection from is not willing to protect you. You don't necessarily have to be a citizen of that state in order to claim that another state is targeting you in this fashion. So I just want to say that from the get-go, we're in a situation where Canadian refugee law does not recognize statelessness as a ground for protection, and it really pushes people to try to fit into these very narrow boxes of having to show that they would face, risk to their life, risk to torture, risk to persecution tied to a ground that is related to their identity in most cases. Having said that, the other thing I want to say is that the cases that I'm profiling here for you today, many of these people are coming from countries that are not their own. So Tibetans, for example, have been colonized by China. Palestinians, there's an ongoing genocide there right now, and have been stateless for many, many decades. North Koreans, while North Koreans may be coming from a country, there is a very good reason why they would be able to make a claim for persecution there. I'll explain why. Their cases have really shaped the way we think about citizenship and statelessness in the legal sphere. So first I want to say there's a famous case called Tretsetsang that was, made its way through the courts involving a Tibetan who claimed refugee protection. He had a viable claim, was claiming that he was coming from the country of China and that he would be persecuted based on his political opinion about how Tibetans are treated in China. He was not able to get refugee protection because the IRB claimed that he could be a citizen of India. There's this this Indian law that does permit citizenship to be conferred to Tibetans. In this case, it had not yet been conferred, and yet the IRB used that the potentiality of obtaining citizenship in India as a reason to deny refugee protection to this individual. And so we've seen, this kind of trend in other cases, but there was a very kind of famous case that came out of the courts around a Tibetan case, where despite the fact that refugee protections made out in the case, this kind of legal fiction of denying the status of statelessness to someone, saying you're eligible for citizenship elsewhere, conferring of ghost citizenship, kind of, provides that legal narrative and justification to close the door on people who legitimately need protection. In the case of North Korea, this kind of narrative is being used again for legal justification to close the doors against North Koreans. Again, similar to the Tibetan case, the South Korean law does permit the conferral of citizenship on North Koreans should they apply. And as many of you might have experienced in applying for citizenship, it's not a light endeavor. There's many qualifications and requirements and processes to undergo. It's not an easy thing to obtain. Again, many cases where North Koreans have not yet applied, have not expressed a desire, have not even stepped foot in South Korea, and are being told that they're really South Koreans. You really shouldn't be coming to us to ask for refugee protection because, well, you can get citizenship in South Korea. And so there's a whole slew of cases that have really gaslit North Koreans by saying you're not really in need of protection, go to South Korea, despite the fact that there's no proof or evidence that they will actually get citizenship there. Finally, there's a whole slew of cases involving Palestinians. Many of you might be aware that the Palestinian diaspora is spread across the world. A lot of the cases that have come to the IRB, and sometimes, you see them come through as temporary and permanent residents, they might have spent some time in the Middle East and might have acquired a work permit or temporary residence in the Middle East, say in the UAE, in Bahrain, and in Saudi Arabia, other countries around that region. Some of the case law that we've been reviewing identifies the very fact of having temporary residence in those countries as tying that to a legal fact that they have access to status elsewhere, not necessarily citizenship. And now this is kind of like a very low bar, where as long as you have some sort of status elsewhere, then we're going to deny looking at the merits of your case and whether or not you deserve refugee protection. And so Palestinians are being denied protection at the IRB on the basis that potentially they could go back and reside somewhere on a temporary basis. Some of these cases are really troubling because their temporary status has lapsed, and the IRB said, too bad, you should have stayed there and not relinquished your status, and therefore we're going to deny you because you made the poor choice of giving up that status to come to Canada. So I just want to say, that these are just, at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kinds of cases that we've seen. That the main trends I want you to take away from this is that in all these cases, none of these people are citizens of the countries that Canada claims they are, or make a legal finding that they are. They use this legal fact to deny a true examination of whether these people should have refugee protection. And in many cases, they do make a very strong claim for refugee protection. Nevertheless, I find this to be troubling because it does shape the ways in which we treat stateless people in Canada, who we consider as stateless, and how it reproduces this colonial idea of the fact that people are necessarily foreigners and problems of other countries, rather than looking at the problem of statelessness as in a true compassionate and humanitarian fashion that Canada is known for, especially given that our IRB is celebrated around the world as having the gold standard with regards to refugee protection and determination processes. I just want to close by saying, much of the Canadian research is still in formulation mode, so we hope to be publishing it in short order. But I invite you to look at my other research regarding Malaysia, And in that book, at the end of the book, it's really hard to kind of end a book on a hopeful note when you have such dire stories being told. And one of the things that I want to invite you to think about in a bigger picture, to kind of take us back, a step back and to think kind of through a wider lens is, how are states treating people? Why is it that we rely on state recognition to determine who are our community members? What kinds of relations do we want people to have at government counters? What kind of experiences do we want to have? How do we determine who is our kin? What is our responsibility and obligations to people who come to us asking for help and who tell us who they are and who are being gaslit in our legal systems? How do we keep their stories and ensure that there's accountability in the ways in which their stories are being told against the standards of proof that we have protected in other areas of law, such as criminal law and other civil areas of law. So I'm happy to answer any questions. It's a very, very quick and dirty overview of the research that I do, and I certainly kind of glossed over some of the other aspects, but thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to comments or questions and community opportunities to delve into other cases that people might be aware of.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was incredible. Thank you for your honesty and speaking to some of your experiences growing up. So I'd like to once again thank Denny, Andrew, and you, Jamie, for your insights and candor. Today, I think that it's safe to say you've all left us with a lot to consider and reflect on going forward. So we're now going to move into the Q&A portion of today's session, and I'm glad to see we've got lots of time to have discussions and answer any questions. So if for our attendees, if you haven't found the chat tab already at the bottom of the screen, now's your chance to pop some questions in. Just a friendly reminder that you can also raise your hand if you'd like, or your virtual hand, and we'll answer your questions. I'll pass over to my co-worker Madeline to read through some of the questions that have come through in the chat. And what we'll do, we'll go maybe in order of presenters to get each of your feedback on the questions that have come through.
Thanks, Gabriella. And yeah, thank you guys so much for your discussion so far. It was very powerful. So the first question that we have, do we expect more stateless people in light of the situation in Gaza and recent political changes in the US?
I can speak to that a little bit. It's, Canada recently developed, well, not recently, about a year ago, developed, I guess in January, it was instituted a program designed to bring Gazans to Canada. It was called the Gaza Special Measures Program. This is, in a family of temporary programs that are meant to be ad hoc that respond to humanitarian crises. So there's an ad hoc program that was created for people affected by the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. There was an ad hoc program created for Ukrainians after the Russian invasion called the Quat. There is also, other programs. So, there was a program instituted in January. This program has been, in my opinion, a huge failure to assist Gazans to come to Canada. So the hope is that maybe Canada will tweak that program a bit and facilitate the ability of Gazans to flee and to get to Canada. It would be in line with Canada's humanitarian efforts in other crises to do so. But I would say as an immigration lawyer, my read of this program and looking at how the requirements and the barriers in place to process people in this program has been very troubling to watch. And I think it's only just over 300 people have been able to come to Canada from Gaza, from what we know, and it's unclear whether they came through this program. They probably just came through other temporary resident programs. So I'm sure there's going to be some movements of people, but the ability for Canada to process and approve applications with regards to populations coming from Gaza, I think needs to be improved, to say the least.
Perhaps I can supplement that. And there is a contrast, I think, with the numbers that Canada has accepted versus Australia has accepted with respect to Gazan refugees. But I think we also have to acknowledge that the security screening is more difficult in places like Gaza, and the security considerations are deeper in the case of Gaza than, let's say, with respect to Ukrainians. And part of it may be, racism, bias, and everything like that, but there's a real security issue there. And of course, we've seen that whenever somebody gets through the system, and then sort of is flagged or is discovered to have sort of malicious security intent with respect to Canada or our neighbor to the south, that becomes an issue. And of course, even prior to the recent US election, there's always been a paranoia, but it may be a legitimate paranoia, is what happens if somebody enters Canada through whatever program, and then goes to the US and tries to commit a terrorist or violent offense. We saw that as, I think there was the Rassam case in 2000 or something like that. And that's always been a concern because that impacts the overall US-Canada relationship. And of course, it affects the issue of whether the border becomes hardened. So that's one of the considerations. Now, I think, the program does have its limits. The administration may be faulty, but there is a very real government preoccupation on the security side. And there's no way of sort of diminishing that. Could it be speeded up? Could it be made better? Probably. But I think that's an issue of context that needs to be addressed.
If I can respond, I guess I would say in response to that is that there is dangerous rhetoric painting people that are coming from a genocide as terrorists, and that this is not to say that we shouldn't have security screening. We saw in the Ukrainian Special Measures Program that they diverted resources and brought people to neighboring countries outside of Ukraine to do security screening. The same thing could be done. We've seen it in Jordan when we implemented a huge resettlement program of Syrians. Arguably there is a security concern there too, but immense numbers of Syrian people were moved to Canada in very short order. So to say that security is a concern, I don't diminish that. However, to raise that as an issue as to why processing is slow, that to me is not an excuse, because we've seen Canada move resources when they have the political will to do it, and to do it in a way that respects the fact that people on the ground are literally fleeing very dangerous situations. And so I just want to acknowledge that that has happened for Ukrainians, for Syrians, and it can be done again, and it is not being done. And it tells you that there is something, there's a lack of political will. And I would also challenge everyone to maybe not use the term terrorist and not to paint. It is, that term is very loaded and can really be damaging to the project of dehumanizing, which I think is part and parcel the reason why we're here today, is to talk about stateless populations and how we should reduce the dehumanization of them. And I think using those terms are not helpful when we're talking about this in this context.
Well, I think the terms are being used in any case. And so, yes, you can nuance them, but I think you can say violent extremists. I mean, I worked on, when I was in multiculturalism, we worked on the terminology, and it's a nightmare because no matter what word you do, you always have that. And I think the reality of all these programs is that they're all based to a certain extent on discrimination, because governments have to make choices, officials have to make choices. So there's always going to be an element there. So the debate actually has to be more over, is it a legitimate form to discriminate against this group versus that group? Are there real factors? And and Jamie, where I'm with you is, that you want to see consistency in terms of decisions, criteria, and everything like that. And I think that's absolutely essential, because that's where I think a lot of the problems arise, and that sometimes individual discretion of offices goes the wrong way.
Thank you all for your debate on that question, and to loop back to the topic of today's webinar, I'll just move along to the next question, which is how can we foster greater awareness of the issue of statelessness, and what role do cultural, legal, and political institutions play in addressing the issue in the Northern American region?
I can speak to that a little bit if I may. First of all, in terms of from the cultural aspect, the Roma people are classified as an ethnic group. And being a stateless nation, we consider ourselves a stateless nation, which is something we advocate for at the government levels. Again, I will reiterate that, we are basically trying to create coalitions with other organizations, government support, officials who were willing to support us, legal organizations, media, because more awareness needs to be raised on these issues, because a lot of people are unaware, of the struggles that stateless people go through. I mean, there are several different avenues that can be approached from all aspects in terms of the question that was asked, but from a cultural and institutional and uh, organizational aspect, I would say that the best thing that anybody listening can do is educate yourselves on these topics that were discussed today and help raise awareness, because your voice goes a long way in terms of sharing knowledge and experience, because there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings of all communities, not just the Roma people. And people are unaware that let's say these people that are here from Gaza or from anywhere else in the world that are stateless, they go through the same issues as any other ethnic racial group, and same struggles. So that it's humanity that's most important. And I think that things can change with the right people.
If I can add to, I guess I would say that, amplifying stories from stateless persons themselves, one of the things that I found so enriching about when I was speaking with stateless persons and their families was just how aware they were about their role in changing public narrative. One of the things that I think is needed is just basic training of the awareness of the term stateless. There's a lot of people who don't know what that term means. And even within IRCC, like, I don't know if bureaucrats or border officials actually know what that term is or understand it. And when they're filling out forms or adding things to, official records, you can see that they don't understand that term and it's not within their lexicon, and so I think just, having a broader awareness of what that term means, what that, and shedding light on other people's narratives and stories about what it is, what that existence feels like, how it differs for different communities. We're going to probably see a lot more people. Andrew mentioned that he was surprised that there was a lot of stateless people coming from India. Well, there's a very good reason for that. I mean, an entire population of Assamese were declared stateless overnight, and so when we see citizenship to be weaponized against populations to kind of create division, to dehumanize them, to exclude them from the social life and political life of a country. We saw this with the Rohingya, again, another population that by law were stripped of citizenship. These places are not mistakes. They're all linked. They're all post-British colonial states that have used law to create differentiated and hierarchical ideas of belonging and and who's deserving of citizenship. And so we're seeing really violent weaponization of citizenship to be used. You know, we can trace this back to why Palestinians are stateless today as well. So I think, you know, having a general understanding of these kinds of historical ways of creation of statelessness, as Denny said, read, you know, there's like amazing amounts of work that are being produced now by artists, by creative writers, but also by scholars about different areas of the world. And why is it that people are now stateless? Why are we seeing greater populations of stateless people created, maintained, and why are they on the move? You know, so I think just having a curiosity about this and encouraging others to talk about it is important.
Thank you so much for sharing. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to comment on this at all?
Well, I mean, I also sort of think that stories are the best way. You know, I'm a data guy, you know, my apologies, but it's when I was working, it always struck me that we were very reliant on the data, but the political level was very reliant on the stories, because the stories are how you communicate and how you sort of relate it from an abstract concept to what it actually means in practice. So I think those kind of stories, and whether it be through art, whether it be through you know, reporting, whether, you know, through some of the academic work that Jamie and others do in terms of sort of the qualitative research rather than the quantitative, I think that's probably the way to go ahead. And I came to the conclusion that when I was working, I needed a mix of the hard data and the softer, but nevertheless revelatory soft data through anecdotes and personal stories.
Amazing. Thank you all for commenting on that. We'll move on to the next question here. So with no access to healthcare, pensions, and work, how do stateless people manage?
So I'll speak to that a little bit if I may. In terms of experience and all of the people that we serve, our communities and even family members, you know, people get jobs, labor jobs and things like that to support themselves, and everything like in terms of healthcare is paid out of pocket with no insurance or anything like that. Though here in the States, I don't know how it is in Canada, but there are also hospital networks that um, do have these clinics where, you know, we help people connect to these clinics where they can get some sort of health care. And in terms of legal aid or any you know benefits that come from states, countries, it's very difficult. It's a big struggle. There's a lot of people who are, you know, in our communities who are begging on the streets, holding signs, asking for help or anything they can get because they're unable to get, you know, legitimate jobs. Those who are able to do labor jobs, they're doing a little bit better, but overall, it's very difficult for stateless people in general to navigate through the uh, supporting themselves. You know, housing is a critical issue. There's a lot of people in parts of Europe, even here in the US, who are homeless because they cannot get, you know, even if there's, you know, state funded housing, they're not. They don't have access to that because they lack the identity cards that they need. And even if they are documented, they don't qualify under certain regulations that they have. So it's a you know it's a cycle that needs to be broken.
Thank you for sharing that. Jamie and Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to say on this before we move on?
I just have one thing to add is that one of the things I found so heartening about doing this research was discovering the many communities and organizations that were formed to support stateless people. communities and organizations that would fundraise to pitch in for kids to obtain school supplies or pay for tuition to private schools, or professionals to provide medical care, and things like that. So I think, it's survival is basically on the goodwill of people in the community, and the NGOs that decide to divert their scarce resources to supporting stateless people.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your responses, everyone. So the next question that we have is stateless impacts a sense of belonging. What effect does this have on family life?
When I was interviewing some family members in Malaysia, for example, I heard some really heartbreaking stories of parents who had not told their children that they were stateless, and really trying to protect their childhood and hoping that they could regularize their status before they would have to tell them. It's a huge problem. There were some family members who were not speaking to other branches of their family and couldn't obtain documentation from them to substantiate their citizenship applications. There's family dynamics really do get affected by this issue. I spoke with couples who divorced over this issue because the stress of managing it does break families apart. And people have made very difficult choices to migrate and leaving other people behind, because the immigration applications would only permit certain people to go. So there's some very heartbreaking stories about family breakdown, about how to protect children from the realities that they're experiencing. Yeah, untold heartbreak through many of these stories.
So
Jamie,
from
if I could sorry,
oh,
Denny, you go ahead.
okay, thank you. So personally, my family migrated from the former Yugoslavia in the early 70s to Canada. And when they arrived in Canada, they faced several issues, including deportation, hearings, and things of that nature. So they were close to getting deported back to the former Yugoslavia, and they fled. And they fled to America. And when they got here, of course, they were documented and applied for asylum, applied for their permanent residency. But in those times, we did not have modern technology. So my parents were cut off from their families who stayed behind. There was no communication except mail. People who did not have telephones in that era were illiterate, so it was impossible to send them letters. So the communication cut off from my family. I was born here, so I'm, a natural born citizen. But in terms of experiences and stories that I've heard, it affects family life in various ways. Not only being cut off, as Jamie mentioned, it affects family life, and that, for example, when I was old enough to go to school, I had been told not to admit that I am a Roma, because if the authorities hear, then my family might be put at risk for being deported, for example, because Roma were known back then. The term gypsy was used more than the word Roma these days, and that word is all often associated with criminal elements. And so, in our community, yes, it impacts family life in significant ways.
I'm just ask Jamie, if I could just ask you a question. I mean, you've done that interesting comparative study of Malaysia, which doesn't have birthright citizenship, and Canada, which does. And I'm sure there are hardship stories from both those, but how does the family relationship vary in Canada between Canada and Malaysia, given that difference in citizenship policy?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I guess so first is maybe people's hardships manifest in different ways. So for example, Malaysia, it's a very fact that they're not being recognized as citizens from the get-go and that there's an extra kind of application to make. But in Canada, I feel like there is, unless you're a citizen, even obtaining refugee protection, permanent resident status, that's a very precarious status still. And as Denny mentioned, you can lose it, anytime. And, when the Harper government came to power in 2012, they started enforcing cessation. This application in the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, where people could be stripped of their refugee protection, their permanent resident status, for benign things like obtaining a passport of your former country or visiting a relative in the country that you claimed refugee protection from, or those kinds of things. And so we saw people starting to lose their refugee protection and their permanent resident status. So those kinds of people suffer the same kinds of things and maybe at risk of statelessness as a result of that in Canada. And so in those, I would say the same things are experienced, that people are separated from families, experience, and in some ways it's harder in Canada because there's I would say a different kind of racism than in Malaysia, in the sense that racialized people will experience things differently because of the white settler experience here than in Malaysia, for example. So just hearing how difficult it is for people to integrate, separation from family is the biggest one, but also I would say just as Denny mentioned, like the mental, never leaving that kind of mental security, never having that security. And I can say personally, my father always felt like, even though he's a citizen now, felt like he could still lose it, that there was always a fear that you could be stateless again one day, and to not rock the boat. He actually really dislikes the fact that I publicly speak about things in the media. He doesn't like it when I'm in the media because he thinks I'm putting my own status at risk. So I think, you have a lot of mental health and psychological damage from the lack of security that citizenship brings to someone's life, right?
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for that insight into this, and for sharing some personal stories as well. So we'll move on to the next question here. How can smaller organizations be empowered to address the systemic issues of statelessness, and what role can individuals and groups play in advancing these efforts for their communities?
So, as an organization representative, I will say that empowering small organizations is through helping amplifying their voices, helping them fundraise, helping them raise awareness. These are all critical to us because for our organization, um, basically we need platforms where, such as this, to express and explain to people who are unaware. So not only does it help us raise awareness on the statelessness itself, but small organizations need people to realize that it's difficult to fundraise. It's difficult to have opportunities to speak to different types of individuals who are stakeholders, for example, in these types of issues. For example, in the UN, where we have a platform, it's called consultative status, where we are able to send make oral statements at UN events, or send written statements to member states. This gives us an advantage because we're able to communicate with the people who represent these states where there are significant stateless populations, regardless of the the group, we call it marginalized groups and communities. So, the stateless are the most marginalized, and organizations, individuals, and, groups must come together and find ways to cooperate, and the Sustainable Development Goals are a perfect example. In the slide, if you remember, we were holding up a banner, and that banner has, SDG 16 and SDG 17, and SDG 16 represents peace, justice, and strong institutions. And then SDG 17 represents partnership for the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, overall, all of these goals were created and an agenda was created by the UN to have different targets and indicators for different topics such as health, poverty, so on and so forth. And statelessness is technically in there in many different ways. So education and overall, willingness to support these organizations is critical.
Thank you, Denny. Jamie or Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Maybe one thought is that we talked about earlier about the importance of anecdotes and stories, and maybe at the local level, as you're dealing with your clients and everything like that, you can keep that in mind, because any stories that pertain to people in that precarious situation could be helpful to sort of the wider narrative and everything like that.
Thank you. Yeah, very thought-provoking. Anyway, so we're gonna move on to another question here. If a citizen adopts a stateless child, does the child automatically become a citizen?
That is such a loaded question. I could put it on my immigration law exam, and law students would have a field day with that. I'll answer this in the Canadian context. It's very complicated in the Malaysian context. And actually, a huge number of stateless children in Malaysia are adopted children. It's actually a very sad reality in the adoption scene in Malaysia. In Canada, it depends. If you choose to adopt your child through the Citizenship Act, maybe. But if you decide to have them naturalized, for example, if you obtain permanent residence for them first and then apply for citizenship, it is a longer process. So, but there's various reasons why people may or may not do it that way. And there's adoption laws that are intertwined with immigration law that affect people's choices as to how and when they're able to do it. And in fact, Canada has agreements, is involved in the international regulatory regime with regards to adoptions. And there are some countries where adoptions are very difficult to do now. There's certain countries where there's a movement now where some countries are trying to prevent adoptions or children from leaving their country. And so it can be very political and problematic. I mean, just a very good example is that Russia has kidnapped, thousands of children from Ukraine. And so to have children adopted from Ukraine is going to be impossible now because of the political climate and geopolitical reality there. And there's other countries where Canada has made agreements where adoptions will not be facilitated for various political and good reason in terms of exploitation of the communities there. So it's like I said, a question for a law student in a law school exam. It's very complicated.
I just add one thing that's kind of interesting in the Canadian context. It was actually the Harper government that liberalized adoption procedures and citizenship procedures. And what I found interesting was not just the substance of the change, but there were a number of senior level conservatives that were personally affected. And that shifted the discussion. And so it's just one of you always think of the conservatives being more restrictive. This is a case where they actually were less restrictive.
Thank you guys so much for your insight into that. So we have one last question here. Are there any particularly good plays, monologues, theater pieces about statelessness, or about Roma culture and history?
So in terms of Roma culture and history, I just shared a link in the chat of a video of the history of the Holocaust and the Roma genocide aspect of it. Culturally, there are several videos that you could find on YouTube or even sometimes on social media outlets like TikTok or even Facebook. But in terms of literature, there are several books available on Amazon. We have a book on Amazon that we wrote about the Roma people. I can also, if somebody reaches out to me, I can post a link on that, but I don't have it readily available right now. If you search for my name on Amazon, it will come up. We have 2 ebooks on Amazon.
Jamie or Andrew, do you guys have anything that you'd like to add on that, or?
There's quite a few novels on statelessness. I can't think of plays or monologues, but if I do come across them, I will send them to Gabriella. But there's quite a few. There's that show on, I think it's on Netflix called Stateless as well. Yeah, so if people want to watch that, I think that's like a popular kind of cultural show that you can kind of dive into that. Maybe a fun way to binge. I don't know. So that's the only thing that comes to mind right now.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you guys so much for answering all of the questions. I'm going to pass it off to Gabriella.
Thank you so much for sharing those questions, Madeline. And of course, Jamie does have her 2 books, Dandelion and Ghost Citizen, which share fantastic information and firsthand experiences on statelessness. So yeah, definitely check those ones out. Following today's webinar, what I'll do in the post-webinar email is send out some links to some of the things that have been discussed today to help to further everybody's learning and exploration of this topic. I suppose as we are prepared to close out our time here together today, I just want to I can't thank our panelists enough, Jamie, Denny, and Andrew, for your time. Your presentations were fantastic, and I think we've all taken so much away from the information that you've shared today. And I think everybody in this space has learned so much. I would also like to extend a thank you to Sully Adams for recommending the topic of statelessness and giving it the attention it deserves. A thank you to Madeline and Levi, my co-workers, who have helped kind of on the back end with bringing everything together for this webinar today. And of course, I would like to thank you, all of our attendees who have taken the time on this lovely sunny Friday morning to be here and to learn a bit more about this topic. Yeah, thank you, Mercy and Miigwech, everybody. I'll pass over. Do any of our panelists have any final statements before we part today?
I just want to thank my co-panelists for providing such rich context and discussion, and thank you again for the invitation. And yeah, it's such an important topic, and I'm really glad that you're making time for it.
I just echo that. Thanks to everybody. It was a really interesting session. And I'd like to thank particularly the invitation, because I don't normally look at statelessness numbers. So it forced me to actually look at the numbers. And again, they're not complete, they're limits, but they're part of the context.
I just want to thank everybody, all my co-panelists, Gabriella and her team, and all of the viewers and listeners. And I want to encourage everyone to keep the topic and discussion going. Do your research. If you're interested in helping any organization out, a little goes a long way in this. And in terms of the topic of statelessness, I just want to point out that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states in Article 15 that everyone has the right to a nationality, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. So the language used in these international laws can be applied if we hold them accountable. A lot of these member states signed on to this declaration. So we need human rights and our right to a nationality to kind of navigate different ways of obtaining such nationality. For example, the Roma people were seeking a status to be recognized as a stateless nation with internal self-determination, meaning that we don't seek statehood, but we seek to practice our internal self-determination in the respective countries where we reside in. And there's different legal avenues, and this could be accomplished if only people were to understand this concept better. So I invite everybody to, view our website. I think Gabriele will share that in a follow-up email. And I want to thank everybody for listening and all of the questions that were asked in terms of the Roma issues and statelessness. Everybody was great. I was really impressed by your work, Andrew, and as well, Jamie. I would like to connect with you after sometime this week via email because I do have some questions for you.
And to follow, thank you so much for that was a beautiful closing statement, Danny. Thank you so much. And to follow on from that, I will pop links to Andrew, Jamie, and Denny's LinkedIn profiles into that email as well, so you can learn more about the work that they're doing and connect if you have further questions. But yes, wishing everybody a happy Friday, a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much, everybody, once again. And this concludes our webinar on statelessness. Thank you all so much.